Hello listeners everywhere. Welcome to the Archive of Audio Antiquities, a voyage into the vaults of wonders on the wireless. In a moment, Simon Exton and Ken Moss will be here to speak to you.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to the Archive of Audio Antiquities. I'm Ken Moss.
I'm Simon Exton.
And this time we are listening to the surviving 4 episodes of the 1940s drama serial Appointment with Fear.
Appointment with Fear.
This was a horror drama series originally broadcast on BBC Radio in the 1940s and 50s, revived on a number of occasions since. The format comprised of a dramatised horror story of approximately half an hour in length, introduced by a character known as the Man in Black. It ran for 9 series between 1943 and 1955, initially on the BBC Home Service, and from September 1945 on the Light programme. The Man in Black was played by the British character actor Valentine Dial, except in the second series where he was portrayed by Dial's father, Franklin. A 10th series was broadcast on the BBC World Service in 1976. Only 4 episodes are known to survive, and we're going to listen to all of them.
This is your storyteller, the Man in Black. Here again to bring you another story in our series, Appointment with Fear.
Yeah, Appointment with Fear is an interesting programme. I think most people who listened at the time, and certainly my grandparents used to describe it as the Man in Black rather than Appointment with Fear. And certainly for the first few years, they were adaptations or new stories by John Dickson Carr. And of the 4 episodes that survive, 2 are stories by John Dickson Carr. One is an Edgar Allan Poe story that was adapted by John Dickson Carr, and one is an original story by somebody whose name I can't remember, but not John Dickson Carr.
Well, the first one we're going to listen to tonight is The Pit and the Pendulum. This is the 2nd episode of Series 1, the earliest surviving episode, adapted by John Dickson Carr from an Edgar Allan Poe story, and first broadcast on the 18th of September 1943.
Pray silence while the clerk reads the charges.
Item that on the 12th of October 1808 the said Jean d'Albret, being in command of a 5-gun battery of light artillery, did direct the fire of his guns against the Holy Church of St. Martha the Innocent, and thereby of his wicked malice destroyed the church utterly.
Captain d'Albret, is this charge true?
Yes, you admit it? The church blew up, I think.
Would you boast of your sin, young man?
It blew up because it was stored with kegs of gunpowder for your army. I had every right to fire on it.
And that is all the defense you have to make.
I did my duty. Long live the Emperor.
Captain d'Albret, hear the sentence of this court.
This is currently the oldest audio that we've listened to, but you've been doing your research, Dr. Exton. Have you got an impressive alumni list for us?
I do, and I know we don't normally do alumni for the Archive of Audio Antiquities, but there are some marvellous people in this, so I'm going to make an exception. And the first marvellous person is Valentine Dial, the Man in Black himself, the only performer who appears in all of the episodes, although there is one performer who appears in 2 of the surviving episodes. So as well as being the Man in Black, he was largely known as a voice actor, although he did have a few TV roles as a scene actor rather than a voice actor. Best known to Doctor Who fans as the Black Guardian. He was also the regular character of Dr. Pascal Kelderman's in Secret Army. He appeared in the Miss Marple, Joan Hickson adaptation of The Body in the Library. That was his last TV role. He had voice roles in Sapphire and Steel and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He appeared in episodes of Blake 7 and Blackadder, amongst loads and loads of other things. And he was one of the regular characters in one of the earliest British science fiction serials, The Stranger from Space, in 1953, when he played the regular character of Gorgol.
And he also has the most amazing voice.
Yeah, it was okay.
80 a day for 100 years. Who else was in these? I suspect there's quite an impressive list.
In The Pit and the Pendulum, the main character was played by Marius Goring, known to Doctor Who fans as Theodore Maxtable in The Evil of the Daleks, but was also one of the regulars in The Old Men at the Zoo. He appeared in loads of things, Out of the Unknown, both Hammer House of Horror and the Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense, and had a long and distinguished career, mainly because he was bloody good in things.
Down, certainly relentlessly down. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself up against that swinging, glittering death. Of no avail.
Well, you always do this bit a little bit better than I do. What was The Pit and the Pendulum about?
I don't really want to give away the plot, to be perfectly honest, because it's such an absolute horror classic. If you don't know what the plot is, I'm not going to spoil it for you. Ideally go and read it. But listening to this adaptation is a pretty good way of getting it.
I have to admit, incredibly, I'm not at all familiar with the story. The very, very basic plot is, it's about a prisoner in the Spanish Inquisition. Bear in mind, this is 81 years old at the time of recording. It's fucking marvellous. The imagery that it conjures up, the sound effects, the sound design, the acting. This is my first exposure to Appointment with Fear, which I must admit I've always referred to as The Man in Black. And I was utterly gripped. Considering the age of this thing, I was going into it thinking this is going to be a bit hick. Not amateurish, but basic. I was completely wrong. From the first couple of minutes, I was spellbound by these. I know that as we come on to them, there are a very short series of peaks and less peaks, but what a great opening. I loved this one. It was half an hour of spellbinding radio.
Incredibly atmospheric. I mean, you did the whole 9 yards and listened to them with brandy by candlelight.
I did. I just thought it was a sort of thing to savour. So it was. I really did listen to them by candlelight.
And that must have been marvellous, because I listened to them while I was driving along in the car.
Oh, no, I couldn't have done it because I wouldn't have got the same effect. These would have been broadcast, well, September. So you're sort of into the realms of it being dark in the evenings or darker. So I imagine they were fairly late at night. And yeah, exactly what I imagined that they would be. And I think I got the very best out of them. Considering the age of them, they're also in remarkable nick. I mean, there's the odd pop and crackle, and the general age of the recording reflects the age of the recording, but what a great start to it. I know that this was the second in the series, but if this was the sort of quality that listeners could look forward to every week, I'm not surprised it was so popular.
Yes, I've just had a little look. It was broadcast at 10:30 at night. So yeah, late night candlelight and brandy is probably a more representative way of seeing it rather than the way I did it, or even listening to it.
Well, most things I will listen to either when I'm busy in the kitchen or something. I think there was just a certain inward reverence about the fact that I was listening to something 80 years old. And I really wanted to get the best of it and savour it rather than it be just another thing in the background. I'm so glad I did. Now, we've both made the same pithy comment that some of the accents are a little bit cutlass and Paula Quatermass, but not overly considering the period. They're not quite as severe as Paula, Daddy. They're not quite.
And it was all of them, and it was what you expect from 1940s.
But, and I'm going to say this unashamedly, I think it lends an air of quality to these productions.
Gravitas.
That do have people who can talk properly, darling. Don't go to the war, darling. I don't want you to die. I must go to the war, darling. I must. It is my duty as an Englishman. No, darling, don't go. The Home Service needs you.
And it also makes it sound very theatrical.
I was thinking this as I listened to a couple of them, that the performances in it, particularly from the women, very much reminded me of old actresses that I used to tread the boards with in my day. And bear in mind, I trod the boards mainly at Chorley Theatre in Lancashire. But they were very Oh, look over there into the middle distance, darling. Not that I'm knocking it. It was a wonderful time. But there's just an air about it, and I've got to admit I was really absorbed by... Well, I'll come on to the others when we do them, but The Pit and the Pendulum, A, I've never heard the story, but B, I mean, it was slightly surreal, and you have to suspend your disbelief right at the end.
But they changed the ending in this, and I don't really want to talk about what the change to the plot is, because if I do that, I'm going to talk in detail about what the plot is. The best way to experience this is to read it, because Poe's writing is just a joy.
It's somebody that had been at the Laudanum, I think.
Don't care, it's fantastic.
We don't score these things individually, but in a placement of 1 to 4, where would you put Pit and the Pendulum?
Oh, out of these, 2, I think.
It's probably going to come in at number 3. And considering how much I enjoyed it, that gives you some idea of how good these things were. Well, the next one up is from Series 3. It's the first episode, and it's from the 13th of April 1944, The Speaking Clock by John Dixon Carr.
Well?
Shot through the heart. The bullet went clean through him and smashed the face of the grandfather clock. That's all I can see in this dim light.
This isn't happening to us. It can't be happening. Wait a minute. He said he was going for a holiday. That gives us time. It means his absence won't be noticed. The shop will be closed. Nobody will come here for days, and certainly nobody will come here tonight. And
what's that?
The police officer.
This is number 2 in my list. I think you were a little less fond, but...
Actually, the bit where I struggle in placement is between this and the Pit and the Pendulum. I really enjoyed both. They're very different, because this is pure 1940s film noir on the radio, whereas The Pit and the Pendulum has that wonderful sort of surreal, dreamlike quality to it. So it's almost as though it came from a different show. So it's a little unfair to compare the two.
I mean, this one was only missing a mournful orchestra in the back, wasn't it, really?
Yes, you can just imagine Lauren Bacall in that femme almost fatale role.
Again, without wanting to spoil the plot, these are all well worth hunting down, so we're not going to spoil the plots of these things, even though really we should be doing something that's 80 years old. This one is almost a murder mystery, without any mystery.
Yeah, it starts off telling you what the resolution is, and then when it gets to the resolution, you realise that what it said at the beginning is absolutely correct and completely misleading.
Yeah, it's a three-hander set basically in a clock shop. And I think the only...
gorgeous.
Oh, it does sound gorgeous and easily visualised. I think the only thing that I had that I can nail this one with is that the gun, the murder weapon, seems to switch rooms all on its own.
No, it's in his pocket.
No, he leaves it on the floor in the other room. And
then he picked it up and carried it through into the second room. He makes a point of saying this.
Yes, but then the person who walks in and discovers the crime finds the gun in the other room. I don't know, it just seems to do a lot of moving about without any plausible explanation as to how it got back into the room that they're in without that person going into the other room to fetch it back, certainly in the second instance.
In terms of the writing, what I would say is that the female lead goes from being very brass neck to folding like a house of cards and turning into the little woman needing protecting almost immediately. Now, whether that was a deliberate, poor me, please protect me as soon as the bloke turned up on the scene, that may be. The way she came across was, I'm not taking any shit from anybody. Oh, poor me, within about 3 seconds.
Yeah, I've got to admit that is in there. But again, we're listening to this through 2020's ears. And in 1940s, that was sort of commonplace. The dead old lady, dead little woman, let me protect you, darling. Oh, thank you, darling. I feel I'm about to swoon. This one I did love, though. I'm not even going to pretend. I think that the twist at the end, the twist really in plain sight, you could have seen it coming as soon as you realised what the plot development was. I really don't care.
I mean, it was a bit of a cliche even at the time, but I think for that cliche, it was well done.
Which is all that matters.
I think it was originally a Poems plot resolution, wasn't it? A lot of these classic twists are.
Yes, it was the...
And let's not say what the story is, because we're not giving away the plot on this.
Oh, of course, of course. So this one for me would be in second place. For you, you're flip-flopping between
Well, it's
second
kind
and
of
third.
joint second, because I find it difficult to choose between this and The Pit and the Pendulum, because they're such different styles and they're both superbly done. At the end of the day, I have a greater fondness for the weird dreamlike fantasy than I do for the sort of hard-boiled film noir detective thing.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I like both. And, you know, an awful lot of things from this genre don't make sense. The plot of The Maltese Falcon makes no sense whatsoever, but it doesn't stop it being a fantastic film.
Do we have any alumni from this one?
I have just one alumnus note, and that's Esme Percy, who oddly is a male actor. Fair enough. There'd been a war on, do as you like. He had been in the 1939 BBC TV adaptation of The Telltale Heart.
Another Poe story. Was he the clock shop owner?
Oh, please don't ask me that, because I haven't a fucking clue.
I know, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. All the voices in these things are wonderful. They're all wonderful. It's a different age, old boy, different age. The third episode that survives is again from Series 3. It's The Clock Strikes 8, again by John Dixon Carr, and this is from the 18th of May, 1944.
Miss Barton, can you forgive the intrusion of an old buffer who sincerely wants to help you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Bell. I'll try to be sensible.
Now tell me, when you arrived at the bungalow, Philip Gale was already dead?
Yes.
You didn't go up there to quarrel with him?
No. And why should I have killed him anyway? I only went to tell him I was through, finished, fed up with him. Oh, what's the use?
They haven't told you, then, that there's a witness who claims to have seen you shoot Gale?
A witness? Who?
Herbert Gale.
But that's a lie.
You didn't take a .32 revolver out of the table drawer?
Oh, this is the first time I've even heard of any revolver. Please believe that.
You didn't order Philip to put up his hands, and then when he did put up his hands...
High above his head?
You didn't shoot him from a distance of about 15 feet?
No.
Your fingerprints were on the revolver. You were still holding it in your hand when Herbert brought a policeman.
It looks as though you've got me, doesn't it?
I'm afraid it does.
Righty-ho. This is the best in the series that
without
survives.
a shadow of a doubt. And it's also the one that features John Dixon Carr's regular character of Dr. Gideon Fell, who would come on to be immortalized in ITV's Rivals of Sherlock Holmes later on. And there's a marvelous set of radio adaptations of the Gideon Fell story that the BBC did, I think sort of 80s or 90s, something like that. A more recent telling, but they're wonderful.
Well, again, we're not going to spoil the plot of this one. Suffice to say, it is a death row sort of piece. And that's the end of that. It's set in England. And again, sort of murder
we can say a little bit more about that, because we can talk about the opening premise, and we'll not talk about where it goes on from there. But it's the story of a convicted murderess on the morning that she is about to be executed, who has been unable to defend herself because she's had amnesia.
Yes.
And I'll not say any more about that in terms of resolution of the plot. And you
can probably work it out, dear listener, but
you can probably guess that she turns out not to be the murderer, because otherwise it would be a fairly pointless half hour of drama. Well, actually, not necessarily, but that's a teensy spoiler for you, but a fairly obvious one. The actual revelation is incredibly clever.
Yeah, it's more the journey rather than the arrival.
And the final reveal, that final bit of evidence right at the end that has been in plain sight from the moment you hear the initial evidence against her, the revelation is absolutely there. And I didn't spot it coming. As soon as they started focusing on the clothing, it was obvious what the solution was, but I don't think it was obvious before then. And that came right towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
Before then, you knew that they'd had all the physical evidence from the crime. Gideon Fell was being a bit of a Doctor Who fan in that I know something, but I'm not going to tell you what I know.
I think it was a touch Poirot in the way that all the pieces came together in the same room just at the same time. And it was, I mean, it's radio, it's half an hour, you've got to get everything done and dusted. Let's put all that aside. You're listening to these to suspend your disbelief. You're not in it to pick it apart, as we do with any number of things on modern television now.
I really don't think there's an awful lot of picking apart that you can do. Yes, you're right. It's a 25 minute radio play. And so you can't have a lot of sort of subtlety and nuance. But the whole getting everything together is all the involved characters in the same room at the end. That is a murder mystery staple and had been for 30 years before this.
Oh, no, I more meant all the clues and evidence also came into the same room right at the end in order to work it out.
The evidence did, but they needed that physical evidence to work out what was going on.
Again, I'm not knocking it too severely because this is just too delightful to sit here forensically picking it apart. You're talking about something that is 80 years old, beautifully produced, beautifully told, beautifully acted, and to be quite honest, beautifully sound designed. I just can't really seriously stick any knives into this thing. I loved it. I would listen to it again in a heartbeat. And it's a glorious example of radio at the time and everything embodied in half an hour of what I've said for years and years, that they didn't have the special effects back in those days. So they had to rely on story and dialogue and acting to hook the viewer/listener. Glorious. Really glorious.
Yeah, for all of them, the sound design has been wonderful. Pit and the Pendulum had a beautiful sort of dreamy quality to it. The background clock ticking in the second episode really built tension up, and the sort of echoey prison cell in this one was absolutely marvelous. Real sense of tension building up as the sort of final hours and minutes counted down to the time when she needed to go and be executed.
And it was very easy to conjure up, as it has been in all of them, very easy to picture exactly where they are. Just, 10 out of 10. I loved this one. It is unashamedly in the top slot. Before we move into the final one, though, Dr. Accent, do you have any alumni for this one?
I do. And I'm going to have to admit that I misspoke earlier when I said that there was one actor who appeared in 2 of the episodes. There's actually 2 actors who appeared in 2 of the episodes, because Esme Percy was also in this episode. But the 2 wardresses were played by Gladys Spencer and Anne Codrington. Gladys Spencer was the voice of the High Minister in The Ark in Space. And Anne Codrington has an alumni credit that's even more interesting. She was the White Queen in the BBC 1948 television production of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Now, I'd always thought that the only sci-fi fantasy thing that the BBC did in the 1940s was The Time Machine, but apparently not. And I've not been able to find any pictures of it or anything.
The 40s really has become a sort of magical era for you and me. The 40s and 50s, it's not an area we mine very often. And as time wears on, we're getting more and more invested in finding out about things.
Well, on X and Moss, our other podcast, we're going more and more into the 50s stuff because a lot of it is wildly entertaining.
But if this is an example of 40s radio, I think we need to listen to more of this for the archive.
I've got quite a bit of 40s radio, and it's very entertaining.
I'm ashamed to say I've not done enough of it. I've got a dealer. I do a bit of 1940s radio from time to time, but, not too much. I can handle it. I can give it up at any time.
During the war, each of the services had their own radio show, and they were all called different things. And there are surviving examples of each of them. I think the RAF one might have been called Whirlybirds or something like that. I've got examples of each that we can listen to.
Well, it's time to move on to the 4th and final surviving episode. This one is from Series 6. It's called And the Deep Shuddered by Monkton Hoff, and it was transmitted on the 20th of November, 1945.
We're stuck amidships, full speed astern. Take collision duty. Mr. Page, the passengers. All quartermasters to their stations. My God, man, if it's ripped the bulkheads.
Get out on the deck! The whole ship shook. Up into a ruddy iceberg.
What the hell was it?
Keep quiet, please. We're making the examination.
Are you all right, madam?
Yes. What's it all about?
Ice, I think. They're stopping her.
But the whole ship shook.
My word, it did.
Wonder why they've stopped.
Well, they would. They'd have to.
I don't think it's anything much, you know. She'd have shown her list by now. Oh, yes.
Well, let's pick up the counters and start again. Do you know, I had a flush.
Go on.
Yes, I had.
What about a jackpot?
And what about another drink?
No drink, sir.
Well, why not? What darn nonsense.
Well, are we going to stick here all night, I wonder? Perhaps something's gone wrong with the works.
Now, this is regrettably bottom of the pile. I suspect not quite as bottom of the pile as you. You didn't like this, did you?
Oh, no, I enjoyed it. It's very definitely fourth on the list. It's the only one that didn't have anything to do with John Dixon Carr, and it shows. It was written by Monckton Hoff, and I'm not aware of anything else that they have written.
Well, to cut a long story short, it's basically Titanic. It is set on the Lusitanic, a doomed ship. Well, they've scored 2 hits in one there with the name, and it's an old lady in a nursing home who remembers the shipwreck that drove her insane. And for all that it is bottom of the pile, I really did quite enjoy this. I've got to be honest. It was twee, you had to suspend your disbelief. There wasn't a great deal of story in there. It was very, very of the time. However, I just sat
and it
back
was fairly pointless, to be honest.
It was fairly pointless. It was a retroactive story to get you to where they were in the present day and not terribly convincing. However, I'm just going to come out batting for this one. I thought the performances were lovely. It was very, very much of its time. It was very much the sort of thing that you would expect from the 1940s, in that it wasn't some great roller coaster story that was going to thrill you and excite you. It was just a very gentle, I don't know what to compare it with. It was just half an hour of drama fluff, and I think it suffers because it's next to 3 surviving episodes that are a little bit gritty is the wrong word, but there's more of a hook to hang on.
There's more meat on the bones in the other ones.
That's the phrase I was scrabbling for.
You're right. The performances were marvellous. I mean, of anywhere in these 4, this is where Paula sits. It was terribly, terribly RP.
Oh, darling. She's sat in the armchair and she's looking terribly, terribly fair and terribly old and terribly grey, and played by someone clearly in her late 40s. I mean, I really don't want to dress this one down because, again, I did enjoy it. All the stuff on the ship, the flashbacks.
But I expected something more dramatic. I expected her to have murdered him, and that's why she sort of got herself into a fugue state, because she was so traumatized about the fact that she'd taken a hatchet to him in their room, not about the discovery that he went back onto the ship to try and save her when they'd had all these blazing rows. That was just a bit of a nothing.
It's telling that of the 4 we've listened to, you've no qualms about ruining the plot of this one. I genuinely did enjoy all 4 of these. There's not one...
don't get me wrong. I enjoyed it.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it is bottom of the pile, but not by the fantastically long way that you've put it. But again, I listened to this by candlelight with a glass of port and a pipe, and I really, really just got completely embalmed with the 1940s vibe. And I think it's just one of those things you've got to get swept along with. I'll come back to this. It's what I call the time-place element. You've got to listen and or watch to certain things in a certain setting. I mean, you couldn't really watch a Christmas film in the height of summer in the afternoon in your shorts. You're just not going to get sucked into it in the same way as you would on a dark, snowy night. wrapped up in your PJs with the fire going. With these, I have really tried to embrace the feel of the time. I think I have got a lot out of it, to the extent where, I mean, it's before my parents' time just, but I'm going to introduce my parents to these and see what they think. Because they were still in the childhood years, in the days of the relay and, you know, the home service and things. So possibly these things are still being repeated when they were kids. I'm just going to wrap up my thoughts and feelings here by saying this is 4 of the nicest, most beautiful half hours of audio I've ever listened to in my life. Absolutely little time capsules that I've savoured and loved, and I am immensely grateful that we've got, of the dozens of episodes that don't exist, the 4 that we have just as examples.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm not that effusive about it, but that's only because you're so piling on the superlatives. I really enjoyed all of them. There's not a massive amount between them, and even though I've rubbished the 4th one a little, I still really enjoyed it. They're very of their time. I suspect the lion's share of a modern audience would be turning off 3 minutes in.
Oh, completely. I think you have to be an aficionado of archive material to get these. I don't think that anybody who...
I think you have to be an aficionado of audio material. And for the most part, that generally means archive stuff. Archive or Big Finish.
Yes, I'd say that. I think actually there's quite a lot of Big Finish listeners that would appreciate this.
Yeah, and I think Big Finish could look at this and learn some lessons about sound design. And that's not to say that the sound design of Big Finish is bad, because it isn't. It's one of the things they do extremely well. But this was just brilliant.
So it's time to rate these in earworms.
This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends.
Okay, go on then. We'll do it overall rather than in each individual one, because that'll just get a bit samey. What do you think?
I was so tempted to give this 10.
Then give it 10. If you're saying it's one of the best things you've ever listened to,
it is.
Why is that not a 10?
It is a 10. It is. It's a 10 out of 10. These, to me, catapulted me back to a time I never lived through. I have no experience of whatsoever. It's all pure nostalgia in my head. But I adored every second of the 4 that exist. 10 out of 10.
Fantastic. I'm not quite that blown away by them, but I do think they are extremely good. For me, it's an 8.
That's still very respectable.
Yeah.
For something that's 80 years old.
Yeah, and for me to say it's an 8, that is an 8 comparing it not just to other things of the era, but comparing it to Cabin Pressure, comparing it to the stuff that Big Finish is putting out now, comparing it to classics like I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again, or the Hancock stuff, or Round the Horn, all the way through to modern adaptations of things like Good Omens and Neverwhere. This was really, really good.
But I think we can both agree we've enjoyed this a lot.
And they'll continue singing it forever just because.
To round us off, it's Podcast of the Week.
I think that there is only one podcast that I can recommend for this. The Mysterious Old Radio Listening Society. It's a wonderful, wonderful American podcast. It's all old-time radio. It's things like this, where in their episode, the first thing that they do is they play you the thing they're going to talk about. And then they dissect that episode from a place of absolute love.
The wonderful thing about all that old-time American radio is that, for the most part, the adverts are in place as well. Because of the microphones and what have you, they've all got a very mid-range. All the low and high notes are gone. That American old-time radio, again, it's all with a single bound he was free sort of stuff.
And they do that stuff, but they do... I was going to say they do things like this, but they do absolutely this. They've done an episode on Appointment with Fear, Pit and the Pendulum. It's their episode 254. They do
You're
things
quite keen
like,
on this then.
Oh, I love it. I think they're brilliant. This is something I've been listening to for a long time.
And on that note, boys and girls, we will sign off. Thank you very much for coming to pay us another visit in the archive of audio antiquities next month. We're going to be listening to Doctor Who, The Space Pirates.
Oh, how marvellous.
This is a story that within Doctor Who fandom isn't very well regarded, and both Dr. Exton and myself feel that this is a touch unfair. Only one episode out of 6 survives as a television print. The others exist as audio-only prints, and that is what we're going to be listening to. It was a BBC Radio Collection CD release from years and years ago. I can't remember when, but it's just one that we think is a bit of an overlooked classic with an unfair reputation. So tune in next time to find out what we thought. In the meantime, thank you for listening to us yet again. We'll be back very shortly. Ta-ta.
Bye now.
The archive of audio antiquities featured Simon Exton and Ken Moss, and the announcer was Jenny at Blue Box 99. All featured soundtracks are the property of their respective producers, and no infringement of copyright is intended. Title music was by Edward White, and the programme was produced by Maverick Productions. For more information, please visit maverickproductionsuk.blogspot.com or find us on social media.